If you lived in New York City in the early 1900s, right as the subway age was beginning, you almost certainly heard in newspapers that the future of mass transit wasn't just underground. It was in the form of stacked train carriages. Reports described bizarre experimental railcars with 2 decks, promising to increase capacity, but without the need to renovate existing structures. In fact, the notion got out of hand as transit commissioners floated sketches of elevated trains with up to 3 tiers of passenger space. These future prototypes were a magnificent idea. Cars with long central stairwells, interior mezzanines, and split-level seating. And these drawings weren't just fantasies. They were serious proposals, debated in newspapers from the New York Times to the World and, of course, the New York Herald. All the while, engineers were scrambling to find a solution to the same problem New York faces today: too many riders and not enough space. But here's the strange part. Even with public support, political momentum, and real engineering trials, New York never built a true 2-story passenger car. Rather, they created this, the Shadbelly car, which, admittedly from a distance, does resemble a double-decked wagon. So where did they go wrong? Why didn't New York ever truly utilize stacked elevated train wagons? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the rise and fall of the Shadbelly car. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Long before New York ever considered stacking passengers on 2 or even 3 levels, the city faced a far more basic challenge: how to move millions of people through Manhattan without choking the streets. By the late 19th century, the avenues were already crowded with horses, cable railways, and primitive elevated lines that clattered overhead. And every solution only revealed a deeper problem. New York was growing faster than its transit system could handle. Though, to understand why double-decker trains even came into the discussion in the first place, we need to go back a little further, to the 1880s and 1890s, when the first serious subway proposals appeared. Newspapers from that time often published speculative diagrams of future railways, and it wasn't unusual to see illustrations that looked more like architectural fantasies than actual transport plans. For example, engineers imagined multi-level tunnels, elevated tracks rising in tiers, or cars built with raised galleries and sunken central aisles. Whereas newspapers like The World published diagrams showing new rail profiles and how they could attempt to fit more people into narrow rights-of-way. These were early indications that multi-level rolling stock might someday be necessary. Hence, at that point, the idea wasn't absurd. New York's rights-of-way were already constrained. Office towers climbed higher every year, meaning the rail lines, be it in tunnels, street level, or overhead, couldn't expand outward, rather only upward or downward. To make matters worse, early subway planners knew that once the first line opened, it would be overwhelmed almost immediately. A notion that naturally led engineers to the thought that the only sustainable long-term solution was to build cars that carried more passengers vertically rather than horizontally. As the debates intensified, the press began citing foreign precedents, since Europe had already experimented with double-decker tram cars as far back as the 1860s. Paris operated some 2-tier omnibuses, and London's railways had briefly tested the so-called garden set, which featured upper decks on a steam-era subterranean train. And all of this begged the question: if other global capitals have found ways to stack passengers effectively, why shouldn't New York? But then came the turning point: the development of New York City's first true subway. Founded through the Rapid Transit Act and contracted to the newly formed Interborough Rapid Transit Company. Now, as we previously mentioned, even before these lines opened in 1904, the city recognized that the network would operate beyond capacity. Reports emerged describing how certain stations, particularly along the Broadway extension, might eventually require rolling stock capable of carrying far more riders than a standard elevated coach. In fact, projections suggested that by the 1910s, morning ridership would overwhelm platforms entirely, not to mention the trains, and that the narrow tunnels under Manhattan would prevent any meaningful expansion. Nothing could grow wider. And of course, these facts brought the city planners back to the same reality. Upward expansion was the only realistic possibility. So from there, multi-level cars reappeared in meeting notes, engineering sketches, and public hearings. Illustrations in the Heralds and Times showed proposals with internal staircases, raised upper seating platforms, and sunken lower levels positioned between the wheel trucks. A few planning documents even floated more ambitious visions: elevated train lines carrying triple-tier trains, with each level theoretically able to load independently. But while the ideas grew more and more extravagant, the city's practical experiments went in a very different direction, a more realistic direction. In particular, car builders tested things like extended underframes, unusual roof profiles, and modified seating patterns. The result was the Shadbelly car, a single-decked coach with a rounded midsection that bulged outward slightly above the frame. It wasn't truly double-decked, but from a distance, it hinted at the layered geometry of a stacked train. This resemblance was enough that some New Yorkers believed the city was edging closer to a true two-level design, even though the Shadbelly car existed mainly just to squeeze a few extra seats into the existing loading gauge. So, despite the bold headlines and exotic sketches, New York's multi-level dream never escaped the planning table. The Shadbelly cars were first introduced on the 2nd and 3rd Avenue elevated lines, routes with the heaviest rush hour loading and narrow L structures that limited any significant widening of the cars. These were routes with the heaviest rush hour loading, as well as narrow L structures that limited any further growth. The new vehicles maintained the same length and truck spacing as existing elevated cars, but their midsections were reshaped to extend outward within the structural constraints. And that odd-looking bulge provided just enough interior width to accommodate extra seats inside a wider center passageway. Conductors noticed the difference immediately. The cars loaded faster. Boarding crowds didn't jam the aisles as quickly, and standees spreaded more evenly rather than clustering around the doors. On the 3rd Avenue Express, which carried some of the densest ridership in the city at that time, the Shadbelly cars became the preferred vehicle for peak service, simply because of how they handled crowds more efficiently. Furthermore, their reliability also made them appealing for joint operations that followed dual contracts. You see, when the Interborough Rapid Transit Company began coordinating service on the elevated lines, the Shadbelly cars were added to the fleet because they could operate anywhere the old Manhattan L cars went. They fit the platforms, cleared the curves, and didn't overstress the aging steelwork. And for a brief moment, these cars symbolized the high-capacity future of the elevated network. Service planners even considered ordering more of them as ridership grew into the 1910s. But like anything else with this network, the more the city used them, the clearer their limits became. The extra interior space they offered was modest. Even with the wider midsection, the cars couldn't really accommodate the surge of passengers flooding into the city after World War I. And by then, longer trains, not wider or higher ones, was priority. Meanwhile, new steel subway cars, which were heavier, safer, and fully enclosed, began changing expectations of what modern urban railways should look like. And just like that, as the system around them moved on, the Shadbelly all but disappeared overnight, taking the fantasy of New York's double-decker train carriages along with them. Today, almost no physical traces of the Shadbelly cars remain. This is at least in part because the lines that once carried them also disappeared. The 1st Avenue line was raised in 1924, the 2nd in 1942, and finally the 3rd Avenue line in 1955. And hence, this specialized wooden rolling stock went away with them. And sadly, the carriages themselves were also entirely unsuited for resale in other cities. You see, these cars were built to the unique, narrow clearances of New York's old L system, and no other American city really used that profile. So one by one, the cars were taken out of service and stripped down. Frames were sold to scrap dealers, whereas the bodies, which were mostly made of yellow pine and white oak, were dismantled in the yards along the Harlem River. Some were burned completely. Others were broken apart so that the metal fittings within them could be recovered for wartime salvage. By the 1950s, nearly all of them had been reduced to parts, melted down, or sold off for lumber. Though it should be noted that a few pieces of the carriages have survived by accident, rather than deliberate preservation. Items like isolated window frames, destination boards, and gate hardware sometimes appear in private collections, and were usually removed decades ago from demolition sites by transit workers who appreciated their sentimental value. However, beyond that, only photographs remain. But you can help keep this story alive by sharing this video with a friend. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.